Good Shabbos. This week, we're celebrating Passover, and this is the Shabbat in the midst of Passover, Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach. So we are not doing the annual cycle of the reading of the Torah where we cover the entire Torah throughout the year. The readings are specifically for the Shabbat inside the festival. And the Torah reading in particular is a reading that some of us at Hebrew and Brews were looking at not too long ago. It has to do with Moses asking to see God's face, and God's saying, I'm gonna put you in this cleft of rock and hide you with my hand, and I'll come by and you'll only see my back. Notwithstanding that we don't think God has a face, hand, or back, but you'll see my afterwards, my traces, which is a beautiful way of thinking about it, because we don't see God directly, we see the evidence of God having passed by. And then immediately we read about Moses going up again on the mountain the second time to get words of teaching, but this time he has to take the tablets up. He has to carry tablets up. He's not just going to get tablets and words. He's on behalf of the people, he has to put in some effort. He has to have skin in the game. He has to bring the tablets up. And God says, God will write the words on it, carve the words on it, actually. And there's a pun that carving in Hebrew and freedom have similar letters. So it's about freedom. The teaching is about freedom, but the teaching is also about forgiveness, because this is a second chance. It's the second tablets, second chance, and then God's going to come down and recite the 13 attributes of God's mercy. So literally God does pass by and Moses sees or hears the traces. But what's far more interesting, maybe, that is interesting, but also interesting is the Haftorah. The Haftorah. I want to mention first, we are celebrating Pesach, and there is so much going on in the world. There's confrontation and conflict in Israel about the future nature of Israeli society. And there's confrontation and conflict in America about the future nature of American society. And there's confrontation and conflict around the world, especially between the great powers of the world, about the future and nature of the world international order. While on the Shabbat in Passover, we read not only about receiving the second tablets as a sign of freedom and an act of forgiveness, but the Haftorah we read about holds out hope in the future, even at times when the present looks bleak. The Haftorah is from the book of Ezekiel. And I remind us all that Ezekiel is writing in the midst of the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the temple by Babylonians in 586 BCE and the exile of much of the community to what is now Iraq. That's interesting too for our time. Iraq. And Ezekiel is living not in Israel, but as much as he writes about the temple in Jerusalem, he never gets there. He's never there, at least not physically. And at the time that he's living, there seems to be no likelihood, very little likelihood of the people returning home to Zion, because that only happens after the Persian Empire rises up and destroys what is then the prevailing world order by defeating Babylon and decreeing that Jews who wanted to could begin to return to Jerusalem. And the rest could send money, starting some sort of Babylonian Jewish appeal, probably. But Ezekiel in Babylon, where the people, where it seems like that's where the people are gonna be for quite some time, has this vision. This is the reading for the Haftorah for today. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and the Lord carried me out in a spirit, or ruach, wind, and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. And God caused me to pass by them round about, and behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And God said to me, Ben Adam, son of humanity, son of human, mortal, O mortal, can these bones live? And I answered, Adonai, God, you know. And then God said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O you dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a commotion, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I beheld, and lo, there were sinews upon them, and flesh came up, and skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them, no ruach, no spirit. Then God said to me, prophesy unto the breath, prophesy, you mortal, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, the four ruchot, ruach, ruchot. O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as God commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great host. Then God said to me, Son of man, son of humanity, Ben Adam, mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are clean cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves, O my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves and caused you to come up out of your graves, my people. And I will put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land, and you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and performed it, says the Lord. A powerful vision. A powerful vision. And in this reading, we have an interpretation of the vision. The reading suggests no necessity to take it literally. What are these bones? Who are these bones? These are the people of Israel. What is the message? I'm going to change the world order eventually. You will go back to the land. You think you're dried up. You think you're dried up. You think you have no hope. But there will be hope. There is hope. This expression, our hope is lost. Our hope is lost. In the Hebrew, avda tikvatenu. Does that sound familiar at all? avda tikvatenu. Maybe it sounds familiar, but you don't know where you've heard it. Od lo avda tikvatenu. Od lo avda tikvatenu. Aim betin no talpaim. Liotam chofshi be'artzenu. To be a free people in our land. The Zionist anthem, which became Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the Hope, is based on a poem by Naphtali Hertz Imber, who at age 21 in 1877 wrote those words and used this phrase, Od lo avda tikvatenu, our hope is not lost. Our hope is not lost. It says something about the upheaval in the Jewish world in the last couple centuries to point out that the author of Hatikva was born in 1856 in part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that is now the Ukraine, another hotspot. He first became a Yiddish poet and then a Hebrew poet. In his 20s, he moved to Ottoman Palestine and then to London. And then he traveled through Paris and Berlin and Bombay, now Mumbai, and eventually around the United States. And he died in 1909 in New York City. And in 1953, he was reinterred in Jerusalem. That says something about the upheaval of the world, for Jews in particular at that moment. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan was an influential thinker in the American Jewish community and founder of Reconstructionism. And he lived and worked and wrote during this and later times of upheaval in the Jewish world. Kaplan's writings were all about trying to help Jews, and American Jews in particular, come to some understanding of what was going on with them in their world, in their moment. And his writings continue to bear relevance, even though many of them are a century old at this point. We have so much upheaval again. In Kaplan's book, The Future of the American Jew, not from 100 years ago, but 75 years ago, 1948, the same year as Israel's founding, Kaplan has an entire chapter on education for democracy. He writes that in our day, democracy needs religious sanction. Democracy needs direct support from our historical religious traditions. He believed that democracy was essential to world improvement, and that, in his words, the aim of all education must be world improvement. Lacking in that aim, all education is training in the capacity to dominate. All education is training in the capacity to dominate if it's not aimed at world improvement. And he wrote that education must enable people to, again in his words, distinguish between genuine democracy and mass tyranny, which is a spurious imitation of democracy. And that Jewish tradition could help in that process of education. In particular, he saw many relevant pedagogical lessons embedded in the Passover Seder that, if followed through, could assist everyone in educating towards world betterment. Education towards democracy, he wrote, needs to address questions of the uses and abuses of power. And the Seder is an example of teaching a child, in his words, effectively to be free, to cherish freedom, and to know how to use it. In this one chapter on education and democracy, he says more about education and religious principle than I can get into. But when we look out at the world around us and see challenges to freedom and democracy in all democratic strongholds, and growing confrontation with parts of the world that do not value democracy at all, Kaplan's writings are no less relevant than they were when he wrote them. He writes how Jewish methods of Talmud Torah study, could be models for strengthening American democracy. He says, these are his words, mere patriotic reverence of the American Constitution will not enable it to serve as a dike against the threatening tide of mass tyranny and state despotism. Not even memorizing every word of the Constitution will be of any avail. Judaism has always maintained that the written law means nothing without its interpretation or oral law. So people must be trained to apply standards of reason and justice to all human interaction. Teaching these principles in the same way Talmud is traditionally taught would help to improve the world. And he says, it is hardly necessary to point out that of all the elements in our population, we Jews have most at stake in the struggle of democracy against mass tyranny and state despotism. There is nothing we Jews dread more than the evil slogan of mass tyranny: one people, one state, one leader. I don't know if that rings a bell at all. Maybe if I said it in German, it would, because that was Hitler's slogan: one people, one state, one leader. Yet Kaplan says there's nothing for which we yearn more than for the day when all people will hear the good tidings: one humanity, one divine kingdom, one God. So as the Aleinu concludes, V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz. In that day God will reign over all the earth. Vayom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. In that day God will be one and God's name will be one. Shabbat Shalom. Chag Pesach Sameach. Keep up the hope. Keep the hope.